Climate change is now rapid, widespread, and intensifying. That is according to a devastating report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which warns that many human-caused effects are now irreversible. The UN Secretary General called the findings a code red for humanity, adding that it must be a death knell for coal and fossil fuels. NBC News correspondent Josh Lederman is outside the UN building in New York City. So, Josh, this is obviously a damning report by the UN's climate panel. Walk us through some of the major findings.
Well, Joe, one of the more alarming findings from this report, no matter what we do, our future is going to be warmer than it is right now. That's because, according to the more than 230 authors from around the world who compiled this report, we are going to see climate change that is now locked in, effects that cannot be undone. And even if we were to zero out emissions tomorrow, which obviously is not going to happen, we wouldn't see the climate start to stabilize as far as temperatures for another 20 to 30 years. But that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. This path forward lays out a very narrow window over about 10 years for us to get emissions in check and avert even worse effects that we would see from 2, 3, even 4 degrees Celsius of global warming.
So, Josh, I know we're already, of course, seeing some of the effects of climate change. Just look at the West Coast this summer. But what are some other major climate effects that we are likely to see if we continue down the same path?
Well, we're going to see sea levels continue to rise because that ice that's melting around the world, that's going to continue that deep sea warming, and that is going to create additional effects across the world, the kinds of extreme weather events we've been talking about all throughout this year, Joe. More tropical cyclones, more heat waves, more fire conditions, as well as droughts and extreme rainfall. And in coastal areas, we're going to see a lot more flooding.
And Josh, this report comes 3 months before the big UN climate change conference. What do the report's authors say needs to happen right now in order to try and address this? Is there any hope at all for meaningful action?
There is, if it happens really soon, if the world is able within the next 10 years to basically zero out our emissions, meaning no more greenhouse gas emissions and actually a net negative emissions of heat-trapping gases. I spoke just a few minutes ago to Co Barrett, who's the vice chair of the UN's IPCC. She's also a senior advisor at NOAA here in the United States. Here's what she said needs to happen.
Well, if we take dramatic action in the next in the very near term, we can start to keep some of the most dire effects of climate change at bay. Sea level rise, that's something that's baked into the system from previous emissions, so that will continue to rise for even, a century or more. But other things like reducing, stemming the retreat of glaciers, making sure that, we can kind of start to limit the number of extreme events. Those are all within reach.
Ahead of that climate conference that you mentioned in Scotland, Joe, coming up in November, the U.S. government has already committed to cut emissions at least 50% by the end of the decade, on path to net zero by 2050. Now the key question is whether all governments will commit to steps that are even more ambitious than that. Joe?
All right, Josh Lederman reporting on that incredibly important report. Thanks so much, Josh.